Thank you very much for the wonderful opportunity to present the topic that I'm going to present here today. So let's starting with the very beginning. What is Final Fantasy? I assume that most of the people who are present here today, already know, based on the context, what Final Fantasy is. But I can say that is a series of role-playing games that was first published in Japan in 1987, and that continues to this day, both with main titles and with spin-off titles too. Basically, each game has an independent story. Then, um, why am I presenting this topic about the games in general? Because there are some common factors between the various games, and this is what led me to the topic that I'm presenting here today. During one of the pandemics, um, I was at home. During one of the pandemic periods, I was at home. I was playing a video game, and this exact same scene that you can see in the screen right now happened. My characters were facing an enemy, and eventually that enemy used a wind slash, an attack based on an wind element against my characters. Um, what important? This usually wouldn't be important at all, except that I had been reading the Epic of Gilgamesh in Portuguese a few hours before. And when I was reading the book, I came across this sequence. It is presented here in Portuguese, but for the sake of those who do not speak Portuguese, I'm going to translate it very loosely. Shamash against Umbaba incited the major winds, the south, the north, the west, and the east, these winds, and then the text mentions different kinds of winds, and then it proceeds. The 13 winds rose, and Umbaba darkened his face. He did not move forward, he did not move backwards, and Gilgamesh's weapon reached Umbaba. Eventually, Umbaba is killed by this. Why is this important? Because when I was playing the video game, I was actually facing a team composed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu. I was facing these two enemies at the same time, and this relationship with the text itself really intrigued me. And so I went to explore further the game and found that in the same game you can also find an enemy called Umbaba, and you can even face in, I think it's in Final Fantasy 11, you can find a piece of equipment that alludes to the god Shamash, the Shamash robe. Would this be just a one-time occurrence? uh, at first I thought maybe this was a coincidence, maybe it's not, but as I explored the game further, I noticed that there were many more such instances. For example, you can see here one of the enemies that you face in the game, which is a creature, a marine creature called Ogopogo, which is a creature that supposedly lives in a lake near the United States of America and Canada. You can also see, another example that I decided to include here, Palmerin's shield. This is actually an allusion to a shield of Palmerin. Palmerin was a hero um, from European medieval romances. He has many adventures associated with him, and he has many sons many sons essentially, also named Palmerin. I could not find out what Palmerin was alluded to in the Shield, but the reference clearly comes from those medieval romances. And so I went to explore this same topic more and more and more and more. And so I decided to start presenting here with some examples related to Portugal and Brazil. I'm presenting here four independent ones. First, there is the coco, which also is named coca in Portugal. and Brazil. I could not find if this enemy is a mere coincidence or if it is actually a very loose allusion to the mythological creature, because unfortunately there is not much known today about this creature. There are not specific myths or legends about it. Then I found another example: the giant rat. This enemy can be found frequently in underground sections of the game, perhaps in sewers, and this is an allusion to a myth that exists all over the world. In Portugal, it exists, for example, related to Mafra, to the monastery, to the big monastery of Mafra, that says that in the underground sections there were such giant rats, rats bigger than cats. There is also the werewolf. A werewolf is a famous creature in Portugal and Brazil, but also in mythologies all over the world. And then the last example is the sandworm, or as they call it in Brazil, the minhocão, which is a giant worm that supposedly lives in the forest areas of Brazil. Then I continued researching and I found more examples from all over the world. For example, here you can see the kelpie from Scotland, which is a creature that, among some legends, has some shape shifting abilities. That's why I assume that he has this strange look in the game. Then there is the Quetzalcoatl, which can be loosely translated as a serpent with plumes. And this is why in the game the creature is represented like this, like a bird with very serpentine abilities. Then there is another example, the Naga in India, which is a creature that is a mixture of serpent and of human being, frequently a woman. I've seen many more examples of Nagas as women than I've seen as men. But in the game, this is one of the appearances that the enemy takes. And finally, I decided to pick this example specifically from the mythology and the myths and legends of Japan about Yamata no Orochi, which is a very famous creature, eight-headed dragon from Japan that is very famous in the local myths. Now, you could be wondering, are these references intentional? Or is this just a set of coincidences? I thought a lot about it, and eventually I started noticing that there was some cases in which this was actually intentional. At least some cases in which this was completely intentional. For example, the first case I noticed was Melusine, which is essentially a woman shapeshifter from the medieval legends of Europe. Melusine has has some shape-shifting abilities. Supposedly, one day, her husband found her taking a shower, and their lower half was composed of snakes, like in the game, like presented in this image. This is important because when the player is facing Melusine in battle, she also shape shifts a bit, essentially changing her elemental weakness. Uh, and this shows that whoever made the game was familiar not only with her physical shape, but also with the fact that this character could change her shape. Then, the second example, I've been asked many times about these ones online, and so I knew I had to include them here. The second example is Ifrit. It is like a genie that appears in Islamic literature, particularly in the book of A Thousand and One Nights, which is a genie composed of smoke or related to fire. And he is usually presented in the games as such, which would make perfect sense. But then, when the whoever made the game made this, they also needed some kind of boss related to ice. And this was important, in my opinion, because they made an enemy in the game that is called Shiva. Shiva is, if you know the stories and the religion of India, is a god. What they made in the games is turning this god into a female figure and made it essentially a nice creature for the fact that in the original the god is usually represented with a bluish skin, and perhaps this hinted at the fact that someone who does not know the god may think about this skin as a frozen skin. That's what I feel that happened in the case of Shiva. And Shiva was also made a feminine being to contrast with the evident and absolutely undeniable maleness of Ifrit. But let's suppose that you're not convinced yet. As I was exploring the many games for evidence of all this, I came across a spear that is called Longinus. Longinus is a man from medieval legends, Christian medieval legends. He is a man who supposedly, and this is an episode from the Bible, but he is not named as, he is not given any specific name in the Bible. There was a Roman legionary that, with his spear, he wounded Jesus when he was in the cross. And then this led to many legends later on. And when one reads the text associated with this lance in the game, many interesting ideas appear. For example, as you can see here, I reproduced the text from three independent games. In Final Fantasy II, this spear is fabled to have wounded an immortal, obviously in relationship with the Jesus legend, with the legend associated with this spear, with the Longinus and Jesus himself. Then there is also some references to the fact that this lance has the power to control the world. This is a very late myth. It is strangely enough a myth that I always heard that Hitler and the Nazis believed in, hence why they tried to obtain this lance. And this proves that whoever made the text for the game, both in Japan and then in translated versions, was fully aware of the Longinus legend, even if the legend itself doesn't play any role in the actual games. It's just a weapon that characters can obtain, but whoever named this weapon and made it available in the game was clearly familiar with the legend itself. Now, as I explored further and further, I saw that these names, the name of the characters and the names of the items, had some interesting relationships. For example, in some cases, the name of the item or the boss is just a famous name. Cocytus, which was the river of the underworld, one of the rivers of the underworld in Greek mythology. Gorgias, which is one of the dialogues of Plato. And then there is Sefer Sephiroth, a famous enemy in Final Fantasy VII, near the end of Final Fantasy VII. And sorry about the spoiler. But Sefer Sephiroth is actually a mistranslation of the original, which the original meant Sefer Sephiroth, the book of wisdom in Hebrew. Then, sometimes the name of the character matches the look that such a character has. For example, when you picture in your head a golem, an hippogriff, or a mermaid, and then you look at them in the game, they are very easy to recognize because your imagination, the way as we portray these creatures in Western tradition, is precisely how the game shows them. And then there is a third possibility, which for me is the most interesting of them all, which is the name of the enemy not only matches the look, but also matches some features of the enemy itself. For example, the phoenix. Phoenix is famously a water, a firebird, but in the games it is also considered, um, for example, weak to water. It has some healing abilities and all that. Just a moment, sorry. Sorry, the computer was running out of battery. In another case, for example, Titan, the Titan looks like a giant, but he constantly uses uh, earth based attacks. Now, there's even Typhoon. Typhoon was a creature from Greek mythology, which at one point led led the Greek gods to run away all the way to Egypt. And so, in the games, he uses an attack that may throw your characters off the battlefield, perhaps an allusion to the original bit, to the original myth, as I was saying. And there are also some special cases which I feel are interesting. Like in some cases, the name given to the enemy is a satirical name. For example, in Final Fantasy VI, you can find an enemy named Siegfried, a boss battle against Siegfried. Now, if you're familiar with the stories from Germany, Siegfried was a very powerful warrior, but in the original Final Fantasy VI game, when you fought him, he was actually extremely weak and you would easily win the battle. Again, this seems like intention, like an intentional relationship. Then, after exploring this, I decided to write a very small and certainly um, not very, not very scholarly book. It was written for all kinds of audiences, from little kids to people who know a lot more about this. I wrote a small book about this, and then I noticed there were some vectors that could be used for further research in the future. For example, in some cases, the enemies have names, have notable names, but it is not very clear what the relationship between the name and the character itself is. Is there really a relationship in those cases, or is it essentially a random name? It is not always clear. Then there is one case, the case of an enemy named Marilit, which appears in the books, in the creature books of Dungeons and Dragons. I had to wonder, is this an exception, or there are many other such cases? I found maybe one or two more, and that's about it. And then, where were the people who made those games? Where were they taking the names and these legends from? Were they familiar? Were they intimately familiar with myths and legends from all over the world? I think that would be very unlikely. So where did they took all those creatures, all those names, all those legends from? At least in Final Fantasy IV, for example, there are some enemies who had their name, who the names of those enemies come from the Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. Why did this happen? Obviously, they were not reading Dante's work and decide, oh, let's use those names. So, how did they come across those names? Once more, I could not find this information. And that's essentially what I can present you today, because I think this is a topic that is an interesting topic, but it is not explored very much yet. Because if we as presenters and scholars and all that could explore this more, these games could be a treasure trove of information, and a way to incite the players to look up and to try to find more information about each one of those myths and legends. This could be profitable. At least I think so. That whoever is playing the games, when they see a creature, they may wonder, okay, where does this come from? Or they can wonder, okay, I'm fighting, let's say, I'm fighting the devil. If I'm fighting the devil should be weak against holy attacks. Let's use holy attacks. This would be very interesting to present to younger audiences because it shows that there is actually, as I once called it, a secret mythology behind these games that connects the games themselves with the games themselves with the real world and myths and legends from all over the world. Um, Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anyone has questions right now, but thank you.